Hi, I'm David Eisner, CEO at Convergence Center for Policy Resolution, and I am delighted to welcome everybody here. We're launching a partnership on digital disinformation, and this event is brought to you jointly by the Convergence Center for Policy Resolution, Civic Genius, Interfaith Youth Core, and More in Common. Convergence brings methodology that focuses on bridging and collaborative dialogue to solve problems. So whether the issue is guns or sub-issues of healthcare or prisoner reentry, we bring leaders together to engage each other, to get to move past the opposition that sometimes even makes them feel like enemies, so that they can find common ground and agree on common sense solutions. We've always done this by engaging leaders and doers in a small cohort of somewhere between 20 and 40 people. And we're really excited that for this discussion on digital disinformation, we're going to be including the national group, and we're going to be including across the country lots of other discussions at a grassroots, local level, among faith-based participants, so that we get a broad set of input and thoughts around the digital disinformation, work that we're all focused on. Disinformation shapes harmful narratives that mislead and polarize the public, that it sows disruption, exacerbates distrust in institutions. We know it undermines elections, public health, national security, businesses and brands, and very fundamentally, the well-being of individuals and communities. Recent polls show that 72% of Americans believe disinformation is a threat to democracy. Deception, manipulation of news and information, that predates the internet, but the acceleration and reach and the scale of that disinformation are much greater on the web. We know that 1 in 5 US adults get their news primarily through social media. And we know that that group is less likely to be sharing facts that are generally accepted and well known about COVID-19 and politics and elections, and that group is more likely to hear unproven claims. Among the top 100 US news sources on social media, we know that unreliable news sites more than doubled their share of the marketplace in terms of the likes, shares, comments on Facebook and Twitter between 2019 and 2020. So today you'll hear about a partnership that allows us to bring in more voices that we usually don't bring at our table. And today we've brought together some trusted messengers for reaching grassroots communities on these issues. Civic Genius is running a set of these grassroots conversations that will parallel and connect with our local dialogue. The Interfaith Youth Core is bringing together religious leaders, and More in Common is evaluating the impact of these conversations. First, before we get started, it really would be an oversight not to acknowledge the terrible pain that's happening in the Ukraine as we speak. We know that conflict and war are a current reality for many around the world, and it connects with what we're talking about today. We know that the human cost of disinformation going viral is really clearly seen during these times. With that, I'd love to introduce Dan Vallone. Dan is the director of More in Common USA. And More in Common are leading elements of this research, and he'll share some more context about the thorny issue of digital disinformation. Welcome,
Great.
Dan.
All right. Thank you, David. Appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to cover some research on and data on disinformation, trust, and the connections to democracy in America. I'm
Thanks.
going to go ahead and share my screen to go through some slides and show some data. So first, just quickly, More in Common, the organization I work for, is a research nonprofit, and we study the underlying drivers of polarization, social fracture, and democratic decline. And then we work with a variety of partners on efforts to try and strengthen populations' resilience to those underlying drivers. And in 2018, we ran a large-scale study of the American population called Hidden Tribes, where we segmented the US population into 7 distinct groups based upon shared underlying values, beliefs, and identities. You can see those 7 groups here on this slide, and they will be the population groups that we use to display data in a couple of slides. So first up, here is some data from a survey we led in 2020 showing levels of trust towards key institutions, business, government, and media. As you can see, the overall takeaway is that trust institutions is low across the board. No more than 1 in 5 Americans feels that any of these institutions is honest. And I would also highlight that on the chart on the right, you can see there is fairly intense polarization across the 7 segments around trust in national media. And media we think of as one of the key institutions in helping Americans arrive at a shared sense of reality and truth. Trust in institutions also matter academically and from research for democracies because trust in institutions enables our collective capacity to address common challenges. If institutions are to play a role in how we respond to natural disasters, for example, or in providing guidance on how to respond to a pandemic, it requires those institutions to have a threshold level of trust with the underlying populations. And if they don't, the results can be very damaging, as we have seen play out with the pandemic response in the US. I'd encourage folks, if you want to dig in deeper to this, to look at a couple of recent news articles. One, Ezra Klein had a piece on this that was very much worth a read. And then Max Steyer and Tom Friedman just published a piece in Politico that includes some interesting data about trust in government in particular. As David kind of mentioned, one thing to note on this is that trust in institutions has been declining in America over many decades. This isn't a new phenomenon, but we can't approach rebuilding institutional trust in America without an appreciation for the ways in which new media and information actors are exploiting this existing level of distrust to further divide, fracture, and create less of a shared sense of reality across the American population. So similarly, we find that social trust, which is the degree to which we feel we can generally trust most people, is quite low across the board. Most Americans say you can't be too careful in dealing with people. And as you can see on the chart, there are segments of the population that have very high levels of social distrust. So the segments we call passive liberals and politically disengaged, you can see close to 7 in 10 or 8 in 10 say that you can't be too careful in dealing with people. I highlight this to note because it's increasingly common to think about distrust in America, misinformation, through purely political lenses with a left-right kind of dimension. But trust maps in a much more complex fashion. And so things like social relationships, education, income, et cetera, all are incredibly important. Race and varied lived experiences, all very important in understanding where and how Americans direct their sense of trust or distrust. And then finally, specific to our conversation today, here is some data from an AP NORC survey from last fall, looking at Americans' views towards misinformation online. And as you can see, Americans overwhelmingly think misinformation is a major problem, 82%. But as you zoom in, you can see only 41% are concerned they have been exposed to misinformation, and only 1 in 5 feel they have spread misinformation. And so it's a more complex picture where there is a lot of variance in terms of people's perception of the general problem and their perception of their own experience with that problem, which can make it more difficult to engage collective action around that front. And I just want to close by just noting the reason we highlight the varying levels of trust and the attitudes towards misinformation is because it's increasingly critical that we connect work focused on digital misinformation to broader efforts that build a sense of trust and civic agency among Americans of diverse backgrounds. And with that, I will pass it back to David.
Thanks so much, Dan. And Dan, don't go away, because as we get to Q&A, I imagine there will be questions for you, and we'll bring you back. let's do a quick poll. We have 2 questions on this poll, and when you see it, I'd ask you to scroll down so that you can see the full set of answers on the second question. The first question is, what is your level of confidence in your ability to recognize digital disinformation? And there are 3 statements. One is confident, somewhat confident, not confident. And then the second question is, where do you think dis and misinformation are highly prevalent? And you can pick multiple choices. We have social media, TV, radio, print, and podcasts. So let's take a minute. Would love for participants to take this poll. Hopefully that won't take very long, and then we'll be able to show the results. Like, looks like 90% have participated. So can we see the results? Fascinating. I want to note that less than 20% think that they can recognize disinformation, and 5% feel like they can't. I'm sorry, less than 20% are confident they can recognize it. Less than 5% are specifically not confident that they can recognize it. On the where do you think dis and misinformation are highly prevalent? We see overwhelming number for social media, but for every other area except for print, we're well into the majority. And then for print, we're still at 33% with a challenge for digital disinformation. With that, let me introduce Jillian Youngblood. Jillian is the Executive Director of Civic Genius, which is overseeing the grassroots and local element of the digital disinformation discussion. And Jillian, we're really delighted that you'll be able to moderate the panel that's coming up. And during that, I'll also be hanging around so that I can be elevating questions that come from the audience in real time. Jillian?
Great. Thank you so much, David. It's great to be here today. Good morning and afternoon to everyone, depending where you are. I'm Jillian Youngblood. I'm the Executive Director of Civic Genius. We are a nonpartisan organization working to overcome political polarization and rebuild civic culture. It's going great. I think we've pretty much done it. I'm kidding, obviously. So I'll just briefly say that one of the main ways we do this is by bringing together people in communities across the country in all their diversity of ideology, race, income, education, and more to deliberate on public policy issues. And we're thrilled to be doing these deliberations right now on the topic of digital disinformation with our partners who are here today. I'm so grateful to be joined today by these 3 smart people with really unique perspectives that I think can really help us understand some of the different angles of this issue. So let me introduce our panelists. Dr. Krishnan Narasimhan is chair of Doctors for America, which is a national organization of physicians and medical students in the US dedicated to improving affordable healthcare access. He's an academic family medicine physician, an associate professor in the Department of Community and Family Medicine at Howard University, and also chairs the District of Columbia Academy of Family Physicians. He's here with us today because he has nothing else to do. Reverend Dr. Otis Otis Moss is a senior pastor at Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. Dr. Moss built his ministry on community advancement and social justice activism and spent the last 2 decades practicing and preaching a Black theology that calls attention to the problems of mass incarceration, environmental justice, and economic equality. Among many other things, Dr. Moss led the team that came up with the My Life Matters curriculum and the viral video Get Home Safely, 10 Rules of Survival, created in the aftermath of Michael Brown's death at the hands of police in Ferguson, Missouri. And last, definitely not least, is Hillari Lombard. She is the host of the Moderate Party podcast, which is a political podcast for moderates, centrists, and independents. She's also a designer and web developer and avid debater who grew up in a swing state and brings compromise-oriented pragmatism into every conversation she has. Lastly, she has been voted by everyone she knows as most likely to start an argument at dinner, though always a fun and productive one. Thank you so much to all 3 of you for being here with us today.
Of course, thanks for having me.
So let me just start out by asking all of you, and we can kind of go around. When it comes to digital disinformation, what is at stake here? What is the impact that you see in each of the communities that you work in? And let me start with Dr. Narasimhan.
Yeah, thanks, Jillian, and thanks for everyone to allow us to be here. What's at stake? Honestly, a huge part of our future, right? I think it's really important that we tackle this. It's a real critical time coming out of the pandemic. When the internet came about, right, and even when social media came about, right, it was such a positive thing, right? Eye-opening, all the information in the world at our fingertips. And I think we've seen this challenge that now modern life is extremely hard. It's, dizzying. We have so much information, a lot of it mis and disinformation that we don't know what to do with it. We're on life rafts, rudderless, trying to keep our head above water. And I think this really came to a head during the pandemic. And it was out of the public square. I think everybody saw that, right? But as a practicing family medicine physician for 20 years, a lot of my work is, of course, not only making sure that people get the treatments that they need, but honest conversations and really discussing their options. And we can see during the pandemic that mis and disinformation, which were negative, but maybe did not affect everyone, we saw how they can affect everyone. They affected the lives of my patients, the lives of my colleagues' patients all across the country, whether it be issues, as simple as masking or as complex as vaccines. We saw just a huge amount of information that was false, that was inaccurate, that was unhelpful to patients and the public to make decisions out there. And it was almost impossible to combat. So that is the problem. And if we project ahead, one of the things that I see as a physician is, look, people in healthcare have sort of had still a position of trust for a long time, right? And now I think there's erosion of that. There's erosion, obviously, in expertise. Dan talked about the erosion and trust in institutions, which is sort of been a long time coming. So now the problem is who are people going to believe for medical, public health, or other information that's going to help them, the tools that are going to help them live longer and healthier and happier. Now, none of those sources are trusted. And so I think that's a real challenge for us. We've got everything at our fingertips, but we don't know what's what. And I think there's going to be tremendous consequences down the road, and from what I've seen over the past few years.
Thank you. Dr. Moss, what do you see as the impact in your community?
Oh, certainly. First, I want to again say thank you for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. Digital disinformation, from our perspective, from my community's perspective, the danger of it is one, the issue of human flourishing and human connection. Second is physical life and death is connected to it. And then ultimately is democratic thriving. And so those three areas, I think, is what disinformation is problematic. The peculiar thing is that my community has known about disinformation. It wasn't digital, it was analog. Since we arrived on these shores in 1619, there has been some type of analog disinformation about the personhood of people of African descent. And most of the project of people of African descent has been pushing against the disinformation from 3/5, the disinformation about criminality, the disinformation about post-Reconstruction and the Reconstruction backlash, so on and so on and so on. And now we're in a digital age where we're still fighting those particular battles.
Yeah, thank you, Hillary. So I'll just say that Hillary hosts a podcast where she talks to a lot of different kinds of ordinary people. I know that you get very detailed emails and tweets and things from your listeners. So tell us, Hillary, how you see it and what you're hearing from the people who listen to your podcast.
Well, I think that there is no doubt that it's a threat to things like national security and democracy, public health, as you've mentioned. But I think that what I hands down hear about the most is the threat that it poses to relationships, whether it be the community that you're leaving, the friends that you aren't really seeing anymore, or the family that you don't talk to. I think that it is a significant threat to those relationships, which is a threat to us as a whole, I think. One example, I have a listener who had a really close relationship with their father, and in the pandemic, their father lost their job, and during quarantine had nothing to do but hang around on the internet. And as a result, kind of fell into a disinformation ecosystem and got radicalized by conspiracy theories. And she was expressing to me how hard it is that she can't even engage with her own dad. And then he withdraws from her, he withdraws from his wife. And then unfortunately and tragically gets diagnosed with late stage colon cancer and dies within the month. So the last months of her father's life, she lost. And I mean, I think that that is by far one of the harder examples, but I think also one of my listeners expressed feeling isolated in their own home because their views are different than that of their two younger daughters. And anytime that they try to express their opinion, they're immediately shut down, or they are given a bunch of facts about why they're wrong. And then any evidence that they provide to the contrary is shut down because their daughters still like the source. And I think just in my own life, I mean, when Jillian introduced me, she talked about how much I like to argue at dinner. That's something I really used to enjoy. And now it's something that can be exhausting or really, really difficult. Or even just like when you're having a conversation with somebody, they're hitting you with stuff that you need to react to in real time. But it's like, how can you believe that from people that you're really close with? I think it's hard. So to me, I think that that is the single biggest threat.
Yeah. So I'm interested in how all three of you actually functionally handle this in conversations. So Dr. Narasimhan talked a little bit about the role of a physician, and, you know, family physicians used to be kind of, I think, if I'm not misquoting a poll that I read at some point, the most trusted source for people. And there are programs that try to do all kinds of things through primary care physicians because they are so trusted. So people want primary care physicians to register people to vote, to do all kinds of other things because it's such a good touch point. And Dr. Moss, you're speaking to parishioners, people in your community who are bringing you all kinds of problems and questions that they have in their own lives and in the community. And then Hillary, you're talking to all of these different people from really from across the political spectrum. And I'm curious, like, what do you do when you're in a conversation with someone you care about, someone who you want to have good information, who is bringing some kind of misinformation to you, and you've got to navigate it in a human way that keeps them engaged and doesn't push them away? I'll open that up to whoever wants to take it first.
I'll take a stab at it. Yeah, I mean, I have these conversations all day long, so it's helpful. And, you know, being a family physician, and I'm also someone who practices evidence-based medicine and teaches it at our medical school. which is, again, really trying to be rigorous in what evidence we use, what science we use to make sure we're giving the best options for our patients. I think the challenge I've seen is I always have these open, honest conversations with patients. That's the way I work, and we've done that for many years, and that's how you get people to trust you, right? Because they know you're being upfront with them, you're explaining things, the options are there, you're there to advise. And so that has worked well. And I work, a lot of my patient populations are communities of color, where there's been historical distrust of the medical community and institutions, rightfully so. So there's, we've had these conversations over long periods of time, whether it be on flu vaccine, which is sort of a great precursor to COVID vaccine and all the challenges we faced, and things like breast cancer screening, colonoscopy, you name it. We've had these conversations, and people have lots of different ways they're coming at or have concerns, and we work through those, right? I think the challenge I have seen now is to what Hillary said, right? People come in set with another alternate reality or alternate perception. And, I'll just tell you, I've had some patients, I'll get to the COVID vaccine discussion. I usually don't start at the beginning of the visit because, that might shut things down. So, but when you get there, I mean, the amount of responses you get is so varied. Some people, it's a nuanced thing, right? I'm nervous, concerned about it. Again, the sort of thing any patient would have at any point, right? And the type of thing that a doctor counsels on. But there are people who, you'll try to start the discussion, they'll be like, I already looked on YouTube, or I already looked, on social media, and I know what it is, right? I know it's fake. COVID's not real, right? Or the vaccine's a poison. I don't even want to talk to you, right? So that's a weird sort of dynamic. Not that that's never been there, but usually people will hear me out. They're in the office to talk to me and get advice. So those can be difficult. So I think, having patients, being honest, and I think, we've had to be honest and upfront, and maybe that's what's not been there in the public square about everything around COVID, right? It's been such a difficult challenge. It's not like there's one correct answer that has taken us through the whole pandemic. So I think those are the keys. I continue to do that, continue to do shared decision-making with my patients and try to meet them where they are. And I think there's still real room for that as an avenue, but it is harder than it used to be.
Yeah. And you're talking about the person, there's kind of it seems like there's a social media problem and then there's a people problem. And this is the people problem component. Like, how do you have this conversation with someone who's in front of you? Do any of you have thoughts on policy approaches to this? So there are dozens of bills in Congress right now that would regulate tech companies in some way, largely social media companies. Do you think that we need some kind of policy approach to this? Or do you think that that it's work we need to do on a personal level? Or is it both?
It's
I
both.
think it has to be both hands, yeah.
Yeah, I think from the policy standpoint, it's always tricky because you don't want to infringe upon free speech when it comes to regulating a tech platform. But I do think that the tech platforms stand to gain from disinformation. It keeps you engaged on the platform. You're on it longer, you're sharing it, you're angry, you're having an emotional response to it. That's a predatory algorithm. It's recommending more extreme content to you to keep you engaged. I think that that's a place actually where it's imperative to have a policy solution, because we need our leaders to defend us in that way. Because if you're engaging on a platform that is taking advantage of things like just natural human behavior to radicalize you, that's not within your ability to control independently. Like, it requires a policy solution.
And how would you balance that with our First Amendment rights? So as much, I get caught up in this a lot, it's not illegal to say something wrong. How do you think you can balance those two concerns?
I think you just need to say that it's wrong. I actually think that one of the best tools for disinformation, weirdly, is the fact that whenever you retweet something, Twitter's like, do you want to read it first? I think that alone causes extra pause, because you don't want to be like, no, I don't care, post it. But, you know, I think that what we saw in the pandemic is labeling something as false or misleading. I think that that's great, but I also think that if you are in the group that shares the idea that's been labeled as false or misleading, you're not going to be too happy about it. So I think that it would be really great if you could insist upon some of the things, like a digital version of the fairness doctrine. So whenever you label a claim as false or misleading, link to the counterpoint. Or, I mean, even if it's not false or misleading, link to counterpoints, or link to like where they can get a set of information for themselves. Because that's what I've seen with my listeners. I always try to include the sources that were used for the episode so that they can go and read them themselves if they want to. They don't need to trust me. I mean, I'd love it if they trust me, but if they don't want to, like, they can, you know, go read it. And sometimes they do, and they send me very foul-mouthed emails if they disagree. And that's fine, that's great, let's do it. But I think that people like having agency in that. So if you decide as a tech platform that it's up to you to decide what is right and what is wrong, I think that does put a lot of people off. We love the First Amendment. But I think being able to make informational resources available to them so that they are just in a more informed position, like our fact checkers think that this is false, decide for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Moss, what do you think about this balance between dealing with this on a personal level and advocating for policy changes that would change the way misinformation exists in our lives?
Well, I agree with Hillary. I think it's both and. I believe that the corporations should be held accountable. For example, my data is mine. I don't think that you should be able to come into my house, take any of my clothes or anything here, and then say, hey, this is actually mine. No, it's mine. So I think that a basic policy of saying that the data is mine shifts the algorithm. The second thing is, I believe that tech companies should be seen just like cigarette companies, but the algorithm is the nicotine. And we need to say this is a public health crisis in reference to how people are treating each other and how we're engaging, that the algorithm is really designed in such a way that it takes us down a rabbit hole. It plays on our worst fears, and we don't feel better in the process, but we can't break from it. Just like it's just like it's an opioid or a heroin. So I think that we need to look at it as a public health crisis. And how do we improve the public health of our nation, which improves our democracy? So we put in guardrails that do not necessarily take away the First Amendment, but it makes those who have power, who are in power, that they then are held accountable.
Yeah.
Jillian, can I jump in from the comments that Hillary and Otis were just making? Gus Andrews earlier said that actually driving toward accuracy would be really hard, particularly in science. The idea is that he says is demanding accuracy would make it hard to do science. As we saw in the COVID epidemic, accuracy actually evolved over time. From my perspective, things that might have been called a lie at one point became truth at another point. I wonder, Gus asks, instead, how we can help the public understand and interpret information better. Does Gus have a point on that in terms of the limitations in our being able to say what's accurate, and especially how it applies to science?
I can chime in on that a little bit. Look, I think we absolutely can have free speech that is unfettered, and I think that's highly critical in an open society like ours. Skepticism is important. All those things should be preserved to their fullest. But I think there are ways and policy changes that we can make things better, because I think things are at a scale where they're affecting society, right? They're affecting society negatively. So to your point, David, about information. So yes, science evolves. Getting 100% accurate science is it's not possible, right? It's not a reality. So you can get the best science that you can do. So I think one policy piece is, whether it's government, whether it's public-private sector partnerships, can they come together to create the clearinghouse, the infrastructure to promote the best information. And I think it's a tall ask for I mean, I saw a lot of people said they would know how to tell disinformation, misinformation when they saw it. I'm not sure I can. And, hopefully I'm an expert at something, but, that's the challenge what I've learned from doing evidence-based medicine over many years is takes a lot of work and effort. So we've got to build some infrastructure around this. And I think it comes definitely at the policy level to say, can we elevate this information? Can we make it more accessible? We've had a huge failure during COVID, right, around public health messaging and public health information. I mean, David, to your point, right, it has evolved and that's been real tricky, but that has not been our strength. So it won't be the CDC who leads this right now because people don't have trust in that, but it needs to be some other institutional or coalition piece that does that. To the second point about technology, right? I think we're at a point where we do have to take a deep look at the effects of tech platforms and all the other sort of media platforms. And I think it goes a little bit, there's freedom of speech, but as Hillary said, having a predatory algorithm, is that free speech, right? That's corporations pursuing a particular business model. And we saw from the recent hearings about Facebook, there are alternative business models, which could probably give them a lot of money, right? Maybe just as much. But having these models and algorithms, which, let's be honest, they have a negative effect on our brains at the neurotransmitter level, right? They manipulate how we react to information, create different perceptions of reality. I think we're at a point where we have to say we have to push back against that and think about some policy pieces to say, maybe you ought to choose a different business model that is not doing this to us. So I think that's a great place to bring everyone together because it will take all facets of society, all stakeholders to comment on that and to shape how that goes.
I also think that the big tobacco example is a great one, because I think, especially when it comes to how do we regulate tech and still respect free speech, you're allowed to smoke a cigarette. We are going to tell you that it's going to kill you. And we're allowed to tell you that. And God bless America, and if you want to smoke a cigarette and hurt yourself, you can do it. But I think that regulating disinformation is the same. And I think to the earlier question, I think a big piece of this is expectation management. I think when we look at the pandemic, the science did change. And that should be okay. We should allow for that. But I think that one of the problems is that you say we're going to follow the science. We're going to make science-based decisions. But I think that leaves room for the public to say, whose science? Because this doctor out of Bakersfield is telling me that COVID's not real. That's a doctor, that's science. Or making it seem like this is definitively what you need to do. I think being able to communicate accurately, like right now, this is our best guess. And then also separating science from public policy, I think is a huge piece of that. Because if we're following the science, there was a point in the pandemic where we could have, if you were vaccinated, you take your masks off. If we're going science-based only, but then the public policy piece of that is that the unvaccinated people will get sick or die. So the public policy decision differed from the science, but when we were saying follow the science the entire time, it creates this precedent that I think erodes credibility a little bit. And that's just a messaging decision. So I think that is something that we can change easily.
Yeah, I have so many questions and I'm trying to follow the chat because there's so many good ones there. And I should have said the chat is very much open for questions, as is the Q&A.
It's really robust. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A. It's harder for us to mine the chat for them, but the conversation in the chat's terrific. A question for Dr. Narasimhan. And this, do you think the trust in doctors has been damaged by the opioid epidemic? And can we undo that mistrust? Leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been multiple things that have eroded that trust, right? Where just as other institutions were not immune to that, we've seen those changes over time. It was highlighted in the beginning. I think the opioid epidemic definitely was one, right? Where we, definitely took it on the chin and were not, preemptive enough in what we needed to do for patients. And so I think it's important to own up to that. I think there have been other things. And if we look at different communities of colors and others, there has been varying degrees of distrust with the medical establishment, public health infrastructure, and others based on past experiences. I will say, I think the pandemic just weaponized it to such a high degree that it didn't matter, right? As long as you found some expert online, right, who agreed with your position or espoused something, people had something to hold on to. So I actually think this sort of way out of it, to go back to the other policy point, is that we're going to have to come together with collective information, right, of high quality that we all can agree on, right, and rely on. And it doesn't have to be infallible, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be the best, and this is, something that we can sort of co-create. And that's what's durable and what will last, right? Versus, just saying there's two sides and two opinions, which I think the other challenges is literally everything. Everything has been politicized, masks and vaccines didn't used to be political, right? That wasn't any kind of political choice, but it is. And with pandemic, literally everything became that. But I think there are ways to unspool that.
I'd want to add to that in the fact that I remember at one point that when you turned on the television, there was no commercial for a particular drug. Then you go to your doctor and say, I want this. And the doctor said, well, that may not be the best. And so the marketing is a form of disinformation because we make the assumption that there is this only one way. Of course, when you see the commercial, they tell you all these great things that are going to happen. And then they say extremely fast the 40 side effects that will happen as a result. And then you go to your doctor and the doctor is under pressure from the patient. You have a marketing machine that is putting pressure on, and there's really no way for, the simple family physician to navigate that because they don't have the wherewithal. So it goes back again that we need to raise questions with corporations that have so much power that we give them that power. And then we start looking at each other on a vertical level as being the problem, not realizing that there are systems in place that we have to deal with.
I want to ask a question that Dan Snare posed. He's been thinking a lot, Dan says, about why so many people who mistrust our institutions are willing to believe and trust sources that are often sketchy. Or even to believe or trust those who have been proven that they're lying. Any thoughts on, to answer Dan, about why people who distrust in the institutional way seem to be trusting the algorithms and the disinformation?
I could give a perspective from the African-American community. There is inherent suspicion of institutions. There's an inherent suspicion when the majority culture says, this is good for you. Like, wait a minute, you said that about Tuskegee too. And so there is this inherent distrust on one level. And then there's this idea of, I have secret knowledge that you don't have. And it makes me feel different and better because I have knowledge that everybody else does not have. And so one of the ways that we have combated that, and it's been very effective, is the fact that we create our own particular echo chambers. So myself and medical experts, we ended up creating our own PSA and commercials for our community because they come to us and say, is this true? Is this right? I'm suspicious when so-and-so says this. So we have to create our own commercial. Sometimes we use it using humor. For example, I said, now you're going to listen to the person who failed biology, but not your doctor. Whole commercial around that. Said, do you really want the person who got the F in biology to tell you what you should do with your body? And then having a doctor who is an activist, one who has been in the community for the last 20 years, not just as a personal physician, but has been doing public health in the neighborhood and neighborhoods that have not been, that have been divested from. The other piece is then utilization of barbershops, beauty salons, coaches, you name it. The echo chamber of small communities, not going big, but small, And as a result, we had over 90% of our people were vaccinated and boosted when we start laying down the pieces of what was happening in our community from trusted partners and creating our own PSAs, creating our own viral campaigns in our community became incredibly effective.
Yeah, I think also just to add to that, I think that you absolutely nailed it with the secret knowledge. I would just add also the validation that the suspicion that you felt was correct, that you are right, that the people that are experts are not an expert, you're the expert. And then when you find more people that believe that, you get that dopamine hit. And I think that it's also in a lot of ways easier to trust the more of the grifter, if you will, because they're telling you what you already think. It requires very little critical thinking, it goes down easy, if you will.
Dean Jackson's asking a question, I assume in follow on to the perspective that we should be tackling the platforms algorithms. He asks, how do you see traditional, especially broadcast media, playing into the spread of disinformation narratives and all the negative externalities that you've all identified: polarization, distrust and expertise, et cetera? Are there ways to improve resiliency in that area?
I think that, I mean, I have a lot less qualms with broadcast, to be honest, if you can get anybody to watch it. The exception to that is going to be primetime cable news. I think one very small step that we could push for is forcing it to be labeled as opinion, not news. Like just a little ticker tape, bottom of the screen, top of the screen that says this is opinion, this is not news. And then with news, do the opposite. This is news. This is fact-based reporting. That's the thing that comes immediately to mind for me.
I would add to what Hillary stated. I have a real problem with broadcast on several levels because it's so poor in its design and structure. Some broadcast news opinion in the evening, and it needs to be known this is opinion. But then when they're supposedly doing news, they turn to, we're going to get both sides. No, there is no both sides. The man was shot. Okay, there's not both sides. You know, everybody died. And there's this idea that I can give both sides around certain things that we should not be in argument about at all. When it comes to death, when it comes to some of the most horrible human tragedies, we should not be going back and forth around difference of opinion around the depth of tragedy and pain. And that's one of the problems, is because we have framed broadcast media like it's ESPN. This is not the Nets versus the 76ers. This is not. This is our democracy we're dealing with. And so we have to have a completely different framing. And I think that they need to be called out, that the framing isn't around entertainment. And we need a big ticker tape to say, this is entertainment. This is not for democratic benefit or civic genius. Okay, let's just do that.
Can I just ask a follow-up question to that, which is, who should decide that? Is this something the government should do? Is this something that cable news stations should take it upon themselves to be good citizens and do it?
Definitely the last one, for sure. I mean, if you can get them to do it, I think that following the model of the Consumer Protection Bureau might be a good way to go, and coming up with a digital version of that, even a digital arm of an existing bureau that is not elected, but just a solid regulatory body. Like, that comes to mind for me. I would love it if the private sector would do it themselves. I just think that they have too much to gain by not doing it. So I don't see that happening, unfortunately, without a push.
Yeah, I would just add, that I think we need, maybe some regulatory space, but also I think we need communication of our values, right? As a people, as a public, what do we value in the information that we get? We are just being dictated to, right? We're complaining that we're getting misinformation, disinformation on social media channels, yet we know we cannot stop, right? We can't put that phone away. That speaks to a broader thing about how we're being manipulated there. We're talking about broadcast media. If the things we don't want to see are all that we get, we're going to have a countervailing force. And I would put forth, people talk about news opinion. What news? It's all opinion. It's very hard to find news substantively, really, these days. It's tough in traditional broadcast media, beyond even prime time. So it seems like they've just sort of bought in for that. But I think that doesn't come without the public speaking out and saying these are the things that we value, and a model like Consumer Protection Bureau might be useful too, to set some, these are the standards of the type of information we'd like to see. I don't know if it'll be enough to move the needle, but that's probably an important first step. Or I'll just, I don't always go to my favorite podcast host for medical knowledge, but sometimes.
How do you balance that with the fact that I think if you asked people what their values were, they would say, I value the truth. They would say, I value honesty. And then they would go read disinformation and think that this is the truth. I think that it's difficult with values because nobody wants to be lied to. Nobody wants to say that they've been fooled, or that what they're reading is false. And I think that that's part of the problem, is how do you combat that?
Stephanie Bean notes that so much of it is about the money, the backing, the clicks, the reviews, the funders. I'd add the advertisers. And Stephanie calls that the great gamification of society. One of the things that I saw in the late 90s, really earlier, from the 70s through the 90s, was the greater sophistication of media, of training people on how to watch the media, what to understand about the advertising, how to do some separating of opinion from fact. Does it strike you that some of the lessons from media literacy and some of the successes from it are applicable today as we think about social media? Are there kinds of trainings, for example, think of a driver's ed for social media, that might be useful?
I think yes, but in my experience, a lot of the time, the people that would be interested in a training like that aren't necessarily the people that need it.
Well, I would just say something from, having taught, how do you analyze information on the medical literature side? How do you use it? How do you make sense of what's real, what's not? That takes hard work. It can be set up. People can do that. But however, I think the challenge is if the algorithm is set up against you, right? And it has its own path of what it's trying to drive you toward in terms of information, misinformation, or even disinformation, there's little you can do, right? I have to say that it's better than you, right? It's positioned to drive information, and go look at any of your feeds, right, and see what's there. So I think that's a structural challenge that we won't be able to overcome just by effective training to say, hey, you can be even better at analyzing your social media feed and make decisions, when the underlying dynamic is something you can't fix.
I think that's a great point too, because it's an unfair expectation to put on the public that they're going to do 6 hours of reading to determine if that news link is accurate before they share it on Facebook. So I think that you're right that we need some guardrails on that to, I guess, give you a fair fight.
Can I just throw, in terms of the public, can we blame the public for being confused or not know what to trust based on what they've seen out of public health over the past 2 years? I don't think I can blame them, right? You go to CDC, but back in 2020, we could even say, right, like what are they putting out there? And there's been mixed messages all over the place, and we've seen, right, what was felt to be absolute science and absolute policy that you had to do has evolved, right, and has changed over time. So I think it's hard. I don't blame the public for saying, we don't know what to make sense and who to trust right now, because I think the experience they've had over the past 2 to 3 years has not been one that's, felt gratifying to them.
And disinformation, I think we need to be clear, is not new in America. We need to stop acting as if we've been hit by something that just happened. As a person of African descent, we've been dealing with disinformation for quite some time. And the way that headlines have functioned, the way that pictures have been used, the whole Willie Horton ad, that was disinformation. The way Lee Atwater has shaped political advertising, but the way that quote unquote mainstream media has been shaped has also been disinformation in terms that it leans toward a particular group of people, particularly their readers. And now we're seeing with all of the aggregation of so many different things that are available, and the concentration with certain companies, and people don't have to go to 5 sources, they can go to 500. That's a real challenge. I mean, that is a real challenge, and people are headline folks. The headline is a certain way. We go down that rabbit hole on so many levels. But we really do need to come to grips with the history of disinformation and not act as if it's new, is my point.
We're getting very close to wrapping, and as I'd imagined, we've got a lot more to talk about. As we're wrapping, we've had a couple of questions, especially from Cheryl Grave, who's asking, could you speak to things that everyday Americans might do to build our resilience to disinformation? And if you'd prefer to close with more of a recommendation for others, that would be terrific. My sense is that helping people on the call understand what they can do now would also be useful. Any thoughts? Jillian, you too. Oh, and we didn't bring Dan back. Jillian, or
I do. I have a somewhat self-serving thought, which is Civic Genius is hosting community level deliberations on this exact topic. So we'll be in 6 to 10 regions across the country throughout 2022. If you or anyone you know is interested in being one of the people who helps craft solutions to these problems, whatever those solutions are, we want to make sure that your voice is heard and you have representation as a complex person at this table. So go to ourcivicgenius.org. The program is called It's Your America. Sign up and we will reach out as soon as we've got something in your community.
Also read Jillian's issue explainers. I really enjoy them. I find them very helpful. Doing the podcast, I have to digest a lot of information really quickly, and they are outstanding. I also think on an individual level, make a deliberate effort to include people that disagree with you in your media diet. For example, I personally, on Wednesdays and Fridays, I listen to people that make me mad. I listen to their podcast. And I think that it just keeps you from getting too locked into confirmation bias and echo chambers and all of that stuff. And I think also when you engage with people, just like individually, I try to always give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that they're engaging sincerely. Because even if the facts aren't true, the feelings are. So the way that they're feeling about that issue is coming from something that is real for them. And when you treat it as real, it's easier to have an actual conversation with them instead of shutting them off because they think that you don't agree or that you think they're stupid. I think that when you can meet them on a human level with empathy and sincerity, it's easy to see the shadow argument that you're having. Like you're arguing about this piece of disinformation, but really what they're trying to tell you is that they're afraid about this issue or they're angry because of this or that. And I think that change does happen at that individual level, because I think ultimately to combat disinformation and repair relationships, we have to form relationships.
I would add that, one barbershop, one salon, one grandmother who can really cook, a coach in a church can really shift the things completely. And I'll share with this on a local level. My mother, talking with my nephew, my mom can cook, she's grandma, and he had some disinformation around voting. Well, as she's cooking, she's like, come on over here, baby. Let me tell you my story about voting, what it was like for me. And so she gave him a story that was family, that was local, and it became lodged in his consciousness. The barbershop that I go to is a Muslim-owned barbershop by some brothers, and they're very clear in reference to the kind of language you can use and you cannot use in that barbershop, and what can and cannot be stated in that barbershop. But the owner is very clear about educating the barbers around information so that they do not become a source of disinformation that is harmful to the clients. Same thing can happen with the salon, same thing that we did in the church. It's got to be local, local, local. And one coach can really bless a community in and around certain pieces of different disinformation, and talking to communities that have been hurt deeply by disinformation is very important. Have you talked with marginalized communities? Have you talked with Muslim communities? Have you talked with Black communities, Latino communities? These communities that have been marginalized by disinformation, I think it's important for people to have a conversation with.
Yeah, let me agree with Dr. Moss there. And I think that open, honest conversations over time between people are really at the root of the answer to this, right? Where you work out disagreements, where you talk things out, that's where you get to truths and whatever reality is for the individual. So that's what we have to work toward, and not only individual, but at a societal, a global level. Honestly, our ability to collaborate together, it's going to be so critical going forward, right? How can we work together? The problem, we think the pandemic's the greatest thing we've been through, and it's a historical event, but there's more to come, right? And those we can only solve by working together. For example, Doctors for America, we have physicians in each community around the country working actively and advocating to provide information against mis and disinformation on a variety of health topics, and we continue to do that. So you may want to seek out conversations with experts in your community. They're there, and I think in this time they'd be happy to talk to you. And sometimes it's family members, it's other people you trust, but people are out there. And I think obviously we've been a little sheltered during the pandemic and not able to have a lot of those human connections, but I think it's time to do those and to talk to people. And I think those open, honest conversations will heal us.
Thank you. I'm gonna, Jillian, if it's okay, turn to Dan for a last word. Just noting that for myself, when I want to have my news feed more varied, I use all sides, and I'm constantly humbled and fascinated at how pieces that I would have called disinformation actually show up in the mainstream on both the left and the right. Dan, last word.
Well, I appreciate what everyone has offered, and would second so much of what was just said in terms of what individuals can do. I guess the final piece that I would just add is I would also consider media consumption in terms of national versus local. There's a very strong correlation looking at education, for example, in terms of media consumption patterns, and folks who have higher education tend to consume primarily national media outlets, and they cluster on the ideological spectrum, but there's a massive difference in terms of what most people are kind of experiencing on a day-to-day basis and what you see in terms of reality if you read only national outlets. And then the second is think about the diversity of your consumption around political and non-political. Again, I think if you're seeing Democrats and Republicans and independents as the primary way in which you're understanding people. Like maybe you want to read something that is entirely non-political to just try and get that more complex picture of what people are really like and what animates them and describes them best. So really appreciated the chance to be part of this conversation and so much of the thoughtfulness that went into the comments, both in the chat and what was said in the panel.
Dan Vallone, Hillari Lombard, Dr. Otis Moss, Krishnan Narasimhan, and Jillian Youngblood. Thank you so much. Look forward to speaking with you again, and to everyone that participated, especially those of you who asked questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.